I want to begin by asking about price and cost, because you all raised it in some particular way. You talked about the massive investments that are needed. You talked about the prices of energy. You talked about needing more money. The money you're going to get is not enough. How much is that a constraint in what we're actually doing? And I mean, Graeme, maybe if I start with you, you gave us these enormous increases that we need in the grid and everything. How much is that actually going to cost, and how much is that £24 that we pay you at the moment going to go up?
It's actually gone down. I've just been corrected that I quoted wrong.
Oh, did you?
Because more people are connecting, more people are sharing the grid. I'm now only £20 something rather than 24. So
bargain.
Good value, right?
Yeah.
Can I take it up a level?
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things I do is I sit on the advisory group for the Committee on Climate Change, right? So they're the people who take the science and do the modelling, test that out. It goes to government accepts it, it becomes policy, right? So that's how that flows through. So there's been lots of arguments, which is we can't afford to get to net zero. The counter to that is we can't afford not to, right? And then further iteration on that was, well, actually, the cost of getting to net zero is probably going to be lots of trillions, but it's about 1% of GDP. 1% is quite small, that's still a lot of money. But actually, even in their revised estimation, that is going down because of further efficiency, further investment. So it's when and how it happens is the challenging bit. I'll give you a contextual one. So if we're going to look in the stuff in the press in the next couple of weeks, so sorting out motorway service stations, the charging industry said we can do all the charges, we can do all that. But the grid connection cost is the problem, right? That's because they're halfway between somewhere and somewhere else. So there's a market failure. So government said, actually, we've talked to all those charging companies, we agree. So they've ring-fenced 950 million to put anticipatory investment into future-proof those connections, right? Now, actually, over time, it's not free riding for the charging companies. That'll be recovered over a period of time. But what it does show is that the way funding flows needs to be quite innovative. At the moment, most charging companies will tell you they don't make a lot of money because there's not enough throughput, but that's because we only have 2% of cars on the road being electric. So it's the when and the how. I don't think it's the quantum in and of itself.
But the charging companies, I think, are basically thinking about this sort of a little bit in the same ways that kind of American explorers thought about the oil fields, right? I mean, if I'm allowed to go off on this example, I think they're thinking they're getting contracts for 10 years on these streets here or this area here. That will allow them to put in money now, lose money now, but in 10 years' time, when everyone has gone electric or everyone thinking about going electric, they will be sitting on some very, 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 very hot property in the next few years. And I think that's the way that I think some of them are thinking about it at the moment, even if they're not making lots of money at the moment. Claire, can I come to you I want to ask you specifically about rising costs and rising prices at the moment. Energy prices we know are going up, electricity prices are going up, petrol and diesel also are going up a lot. Part of what Octopus does also is leasing for electric vehicles as well, which is the kind of business that you straddle both the energy and the EV side as well. Can you just tell us what you've seen over the last couple of weeks in terms of interest in EVs, and also how you think the rising cost of this play into the whole long-term transition?
Yeah, so certainly if we look at how much traffic we've had on the website, it has been a very busy period the last couple of weeks. We don't have any other reason. We haven't done a big marketing campaign. We haven't been sponsoring a big event, nothing like that. So we have to draw the conclusion that it's really, focusing minds now on, security of supply of fuel, security of access to mobility. How do those two things come together? And therefore, how do those folk who maybe, the door is quite ajar, how do they fling the door open? And I think actually, when we think about each customer out there, each potential customer is on their own journey, and some of them have doors shut. And so they're the ones that we would not go flinging ourselves at, but actually helping those where the door is a bit ajar. And the ones that, coming through the website is really interesting. They're the ones we want to go after in terms of helping them learn and helping them be comfortable before we'd ever think to try and get them into an EV itself. I think looking more long term, good point there about the cost of petrol and diesel. You know, we're heading towards £2 a litre. I think we'll probably head north of that, actually. And that's painful in the short term for anyone who is reliant on a vehicle that needs that fuel. And I think that's the thing that I've been reflecting on personally is, you know, it's not as simple as just get an electric vehicle for a lot of people. They are stuck with that huge cost. So I guess to take that longer term view about how do we, this is going to be a very painful period. I don't think anyone, you know, we can't avoid that. It's going to be a really painful period for a lot of people. But looking kind of beyond that, actually getting that word out about using that electric car as a battery and actually taking that view of energy storage and mobility asset together. It's a really simple story to tell, really. You know, it's storing something when it's cheaper, to use it for your own end when it's more expensive, or to use it for greater good when it's more expensive. And I think that's the story that we can tell. And you mentioned straddling the two, and I think you're right. The leasing part and the energy part. The leasing part is about, you know, making it cheaper overall. And I think we probably don't have time to delve into it today, but, you know, there's so many exciting innovations coming in. Mobility as a service. I think you mentioned it. You know, do I even want to own a car? Why do you want to own a car? Like, it needs looking after, and EVs need much less maintenance than an ICE vehicle, but still they need looking after. And you know, why not give that to somebody else to worry about? You just get the bit you want. You want to drive your car. So I think that's going to be the long-term focus, is shifting it from an asset I own and a lot of investment I make in one particular asset to one that I access when I need it. Maybe you need it for 6 months, a year, 3 years. Maybe you need it for a day or a weekend. And that then starts to also like change that cost model for individuals.
Yeah, exactly. And it's more about, you know, payment for access rather than kind of payment for ownership, which
exactly.
is we're moving towards in a lot of ways, not just an auto in society.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, you know, we're all comfortable now with subscription services. Maybe you subscribe to music, whereas you would have had your record collection or your CD collection. You know, we have made these jumps. Many of us have made these jumps in our lifetime. I don't see this being any different. No,
exactly. And Fiona, I want to come to you. We're going to come back onto the whole customer education point because I think this is a really interesting one. But Fiona, I want to come to you because you are obviously bringing together, you know, groups from very different sides of this equation. On the cost side, on the long-term kind of question around this, how much of the cost of doing this is a challenge in terms of just needing more money to lubricate the whole thing to work?
It is, because there's just the public purse is pretty stretched. But for something to be investable, investors do not like early TRL developments. They like the risk to be taken out. Their risk appetite is, they like it tried and tested. Early stages, but it has to be tried and tested. So, you know, where do we go here when you've got the public sector trying to, and it's great that they are quite enthused about their decarbonisation strategies, and then I can't support them by saying, great, we've got some funding, let's, you know, collaborate, bring so many local authorities together and do, you know, joint procurement, drive down the price of the vehicles. You know, so it is a big challenge, and in what it's what's right for a bank, what's right for a private investor, we've got to try and understand it better. I mean, conversations have gone on with the big utilities saying, well, maybe we'll look at vehicles as a service. If we're supplying the hydrogen, then we'll do a leasing model, so it's a total cost model that could really help support local authorities so they know what they're paying constantly. So it's just trying to look at different ways of how do we really cope with this underfunding.
One of the things that Rachel was talking about earlier was government bandwidth in terms of just being able to get their head around dealing with all these things.
Yeah.
You know, from dealing with local authorities, do you think bandwidth is the issue that they're facing in terms of engaging with this stuff?
Totally, and I feel sorry for the governments as well, because they don't have the crystal ball. You know, we need to be advising them and coming up with. So I think they're better off doing less things rather than trying to do it all. You know, focus on what's really, really critical right now and doing better with less money. But we do need to go like stink to hit these targets. And the vehicles aren't out there. The OEMs, you know, if you look at the fuel cell electric side, you know, you're pushing it right out. So that's where we're looking, thinking, well, what can we do? Innovation in Scotland around actually working with OEMs and doing all the systems integration work, whilst we're waiting for the OEMs to come forward as well. So there's all sorts of stuff, but it all costs money, and the vehicles are much more expensive. If you're doing only in your tens, we need to be scaling up into your hundreds. You know, and then you start to get the cost down. On the hydrogen side, we're getting that cost of that fuel right down, and we're really pleased about that. But it's the cost of the vehicles themselves. And also, local authorities like a Mercedes or a DAF or whatever, they'll have to have a bit of a change of thinking. If you're going to do that joint procurement, it may be it's one OEM is happy to come forward right now and work with a system integration company like Ballard Motor, for instance. It might be one choice and that's it. They can't just go and cherry pick anymore. You know, it's that change of thought as well. And also part of it, use of fuel electric vehicles that Glasgow have noticed, is that they can rationalise the fleets because the energy density is higher with the hydrogen fuel electric vehicle. They don't have to have so many vehicles as well. So that could help as well to bridge that match funding that's required.
And it's fascinating because so much of the industry's kind of cost analysis around batteries is predicated on battery costs falling. And obviously we've seen the prices of a lot of the raw materials that go into those batteries increasing quite a lot in the last few weeks. I was talking actually last night to the boss of Audi about this and saying, you know, are you worried about falling profitability from your electric vehicles? Does this change the way you think about your battery rollout? And he completely refused to engage with the question, which is not a good sign, right? That's a sign. That's a sign generally that they're actually quite worried about this whole element of it. So look, let's take some questions. Any questions? Hand went straight up there.
Maybe Claire and Graeme, maybe a comment on the storage mechanisms. Two market-changing questions. The vehicle as a battery energy storage device and then putting it back in, brilliant. And then we've got the other thing where the grid can do the energy storage in that large scale. So national grid, build a big block of battery power shifting and frequency equipment there. How would we take those choices? So it's democratization of that method of storage, pros and cons, and how that would work economically. And the second one was more around as an energy provider and then providing the lease of the vehicle, there's a really attractive cost of electricity is owned by you, the vehicle is owned by you, there's a whole integrated solution you provide. You lease the vehicle to us, really effective in terms of its economics, it feels from your perspective. Does that change what car dealerships do in the future when the energy provider is the car dealership? So those were the two market-changing questions for some fun today.
She wants to
So,
go.
well, I mean, the one thing we need everywhere is flexibility everywhere. So when we have lots of renewables, lots of solar, lots of wind, we're going to need flexibility everywhere. Now, I see that flexibility being in the home. I see that flexibility being in the local DNO network. I see it being in the transmission system. I see it being at the wind farm and at the nuclear power station, right? So it needs to be everywhere in a world where we are 100% clean grid. Now, the one thing National Grid doesn't do is we're not allowed to build storage either. Again, with the roads of the motorway system. But what we're seeing is a huge interest and uptick in those looking at putting battery storage in there. Now, the challenge that we have with all of these things is flexibility as a commodity could either be eroded because more people are doing it in cars, it makes it more difficult to do it at grid scale, or grid scale could erode the value at network level. But the one thing we often miss here is that we talk about the commodity of energy. Charge it when it's cheap, send it back when it's expensive. But the missing commodity here is the avoided cost of infrastructure. So grid networks historically, because consumers just consume when they consume, right? So that's 5:30 on a wet winter's day. That's the peak of the grid demand. We've built the energy system for that peak, plus some headroom. So actually, in the way we're going forward, and with flexibility, we're more likely to build optimised grid, right? Build it to average, not to peak. Mm-hmm. So there's actually some additional value in the discussion around flexibility, which is around avoided cost. Now, it could mean that it delays a piece of infrastructure, but it means it goes together. Again, this tribalism, some people talk about just do smart, no need for infrastructure. And infrastructure people say, just do infrastructure, don't need to do smart. No, the answer here is you need both. You actually need smart and flexible to optimise the infrastructure as much as energy is a commodity. Sorry, long answer to a short question, but it's important.
I would say.
Picking up from that point,
Yep.
does your forecasting show a bias towards hydrogen
Oh, so I mean, in the public domain, you can see everything that is contracted to either connected to the grid network or contracted to connect. It's principally battery storage.
Are there any numbers on that in your forecasting? Can you see that you're going to need increasingly more electric or more hydrogen purely from a storage point of view to balance the grid?
It's not as I'd love to be able to, I'm trying not to give you a politician's answer, which is avoid the answer. The very best thing you can do is every year in July, National Grid ESO, the system operator, publishes a really good document called the FES, Future Energy Scenarios. What that tells you in that document, under 4 credible scenarios, right, is what's going to make power, therefore what's plugging into our network, what's going to consume power, so where it flows out of our network, and the important bit in the middle is how big is flexibility and what does that look like? Because don't forget, flexibility can also be an interconnector. You know, at the moment, we have a new interconnector that runs between North of England and Norway. Okay, I mean, it's roughly where the new British Volt factory is going, right? So, you know, we don't push water uphill in Norway, it's generally run-of-river stuff, but that's storage and flexibility. So it's not quite as binary as saying, we need flexibility, it's storage. It's not as binary as saying it's batteries or hydrogen. It's and even last week, somebody's just got planning permission to do, in an old, disused mine, gravity storage. Dirty, great big, you know, drum of cable, big weight on the bottom. Let it fall, it generates power when it's expensive, and then you wind the weight back up again when it's cheap. So it's a difficult thing to answer, but one of the best places to look is that future energy scenarios, because it gives you a feel for the sort of type of flexibility.
Can I bring it back to this kind of storage question and the whole consumer side of this, right? Which is the whole vehicle-to-grid flexibility is predicated on people plugging in their cars and being happy for you to take their energy from them overnight or whenever it happens. Given that we know that consumers, bless them, tend to be sometimes irrational and thinking, no, I must have the power I need to drive to Scotland tomorrow on a whim, right, in their cars, which is why so many of them are not buying electric cars at the moment.
Indeed, yes.
How do you
indeed.
get
All those
them?
unplanned long
How do
journeys.
you get them to plug their cars in at night and be happy to have it taken?
Yeah, for sure. It is a good one. I would just like to come in on the question before, because there is something I'm particularly geeky about, and that is novel storage technologies. So if you're minded to be interested, gravitricity, very interesting, gravity-based storage systems, rust batteries, very interesting. There are some really interesting technologies coming in storage, not just the binary of battery and hydrogen. In terms of customer behaviour and the engagement, actually I was chatting to someone earlier who's in wireless charging, and they were saying, well, of course wireless is the future of charging electric vehicles because it's such a hassle to plug your car in. And I said, yes, it's a real hassle to plug your car in, just as much of a hassle it is to plug your phone in. And we had a good chat, and I hope I opened his eyes a bit, because when you think about how you live in your home with your devices, then you are always charging a bit if you see a charger. You overnight, you plug it in, of course you do, because your phone's 80% charged, but you think, oh, I'll just top up. You know, make a cup of tea, I always charge, so I'll just plug it in. That's how you live with an EV. Back to this point about give it a try, and then you see how it fits into your life. And actually, to take the point on Powerloop, what we found, because we were concerned that customers wouldn't plug in, they'd forget, and then you can't do flexibility if you can't connect to the thing that can do the flexibility. And whoever mentioned digital earlier, I mean, that's a killer question as well, right? Because physical connection is one thing, very important. Electrons have to be able to flow. But data connection is also very important. You have to be able to send the signal, to tell it to start and to stop. But what we found is that customers are very engaged. Generally, they're very engaged. And when you have an EV, you get in the habit of plugging it in really quite quickly. And that goes hand in hand with the trust. So we're building those digital experiences where it's very easy from an app to see what you've got, what it's going to do, to tell it when you want it back and how much you want it to charge. And very quickly, days, weeks, we get into that. And in fact, we will have some interesting reports coming out of Powerloop in the next few weeks. And one of those is around customer sentiment. So this is going to be a hot topic for us, is how people have found it.
Can I link a couple of things together? So one of the things you talked about on the journey to net zero, 20% is transport, 50-60% is heat. So the biggest demand on your home, and probably this building, is heat. So actually, part of the flexibility, coming back to the flexibility piece, so one of the things I do at home is I've got ground source heat pumps. And I was worried about how that was going to work. But I use an octopus tariff, and they run only when the grid is cleanest, cheapest. But I store it all in a 300-litre water tank. Well, when you think about flexibility, just starting and stopping a heat pump, bearing in mind heat is the biggest demand on a home and most buildings, there's going to be huge amounts of flexibility. So part of me thinks around, flexibility is almost that business model innovation. How do you value the types of flexibility and what it gives you? Now, admittedly, I can't take the energy out of the water tank and turn it back to electricity, right? But if you think about it, 20% of the growth in demand is EVs, 50-60% is heat. So this is why I think what we'll learn from being smart and engaged through the stuff Octopus is doing is actually going to pump prime how we move the narrative to cleaning heat, which is, let's admit it, is not as exciting as an electric car.
Yes, I was going to say, I didn't actually come back to Barrick's point about dealerships and the lease. I'd love to just have a couple of minutes on that. So in terms of the models of ownership and the models of access to vehicles, I think that's, again, prime for disruption. Something that at Octopus Electric Vehicles we're looking at is how do you disrupt that model of ownership and that traditional model of the dealers. And the dealers are worried. Dealers are worried because this is a product that they're selling that they don't have control over every bit of that product, that they're not selling you the whole piece. Some of them are starting to wake up to that. When you sell an EV, you need to be able to explain energy and the price of energy and how you get it and where you get a different tariff and how do you plug in and getting a charger. And so what we're finding is that customers are coming to us for that education and for that reassurance, and we're very keen to do that, and we will lean into that. Dealership model is definitely not dead, but the amount of folk who start their online journey to getting their next vehicle online is incredibly high now. 90% of that journey to your next vehicle starts online. So what we see, the future model is more about taking the vehicles to where the people are, making it easy for people to have a go in an electric car and see one, and actually lots of online experiences, digital experiences. So yeah, that's how we see it.
And particularly interesting in terms of getting access to EVs in terms of the cost and the price, right? Because the upfront cost is very high. But theoretically, if banks ever learn to understand how batteries actually depreciate, they shouldn't lose very much value, which should make them quite cheap to get access to on a depreciation basis.
Absolutely, and I think that's something very, very important to get into the minds of banks, financiers. How you price an EV and how you model what it will be worth when you get it back from a lease, or if you've bought it and what it'll be worth, in a few years' time, has to be different to an ICE vehicle. And the reason is that you have this very valuable asset in the middle of the vehicle, and that's the battery. And actually, we talked a bit about battery technologies. Battery technologies have moved on so much in the last 5 to 10 years. We're seeing cars coming back off leases. They would have done, 10, 20,000 miles. Absolutely nothing. The battery degradation is almost zero. So I'm really excited about second-hand leasing, which is not really a thing these days. But if you think about it, that's how we're going to democratize access to these vehicles. You're getting a practically new battery in terms of degradation, and then at some point when the degradation of the battery does get down to, let's say, 80% or maybe a little bit lower, that battery has a bright and glittering future as a static energy storage device. Then maybe it gets packaged up in a nice way and put into your home, and hey, now you've got an extra flexibility device in your home, or maybe that gets aggregated together and it becomes a grid storage scale battery system with multiple EV batteries. Before we ever get to talking about recycling, because I feel like recycling is often waved as the kind of Achilles heel of the whole thing. But you have to recycle it. So it will take years and years and years to get to the point where the batteries are needing to be recycled, because it's going to have all these other lives, and it's really exciting for the pricing models for vehicles.
Yeah, exactly. So we've managed to take a grand total of one question so far.
Sorry, it was a good one.
Gentleman up there.
Thank you very much, Claire and Graeme. You did mention about V2G and flexibility, and I'm a big proponent of that. I think V2G is a big enabler of net zero. But one big enabler from a technological point of view is the data layer, and you did touch on it in your recent comment. But what is needed is a democratization of signals, a democratization, to charge, discharge, etc., because it's a distributed generation and distributed consumption.
Okay.
Who should own this layer? And is it Graeme maybe, and add
Certainly
that
not
layer.
Graeme.
He doesn't like to own anything, as he said, but add that layer. There needs to be a lot of, most probably, machine learning, artificial intelligence algorithms applied, and which requires a lot of investment. Where would that come from?
So just want to pick up on the point you made in the question about who should own it. And the answer is no one should own it. We need it to be distributed and shared amongst all the actors in that ecosystem. So what we're talking about here is that as more parts of this energy system and transport system become smart and interoperable, and again, I think interoperable was a point that came up earlier, it means that they can talk to each other. Now, talk to each other might mean at one layer, a handshake between an EV and a charger without having to use a card or an app. This is called plug and charge. It's happening right now. Okay, so this is the digital certificate that sits on the vehicle, uniquely identifies the vehicle. Same in the charge point. An account is associated by a customer. Those two devices talk to each other on a digital level and exchange information. That allows the charge to start. The account that's associated will then be updated with that data, and the charge happens somewhere else. And so for us at Octopus, that's our electric juice network. So that exists right now, where you'll be charged, excuse me, on a monthly basis in your energy bill. And so your point about how does that scale up? It is about massive digital scale, and it is about standards of interoperability. So to be very geeky, and apologies to anyone who's, feel free to tune out.
We're in the Royal Institution.
You know, I know, I'm leaning into it. So ISO 15118 is the standard.
Now you've got geeky. Okay.
I'm judging my audience. I'm seeing nodding from the top rows. But yeah. So ISO 15118 is the international standard which will enable this level of digital communication. And then we talk about, who should own it? No one should own it. It's massively distributed. It's a digitally enabled energy system. And that means that the car can talk to the DSO, so that the DNOs, the network operators, are on their own transition to become service delivery partners in this. That will enable them to see energy devices on a digitally connected grid. Who else is in this? Energy suppliers. Yeah. There are other service providers in this space, flexibility providers and aggregators of energy, all the way up to the grid. And so if you can imagine a data network between all the devices that can export energy and can import energy, and all of those actors in that grid that know where there's a restriction, right? When there's a high load, there's a restriction, and they need some more energy, they can send signals to those devices. Maybe it's my V2G enabled car, maybe it's a battery, maybe it's a grid scale battery, maybe it's an electrolyzer. Much more visibility will be enabled. So that's the future. No one should own it. It needs to be distributed. It can't be centrally owned and controlled.
Does the government need to legislate for that in order for it to happen? Because there's too many people who want to hold on to data, right?
Yeah, I mean, I can see someone up there who might have an opinion on that. Hi, Rob. So I think that BEIS is doing a great job, actually. Thank you, BEIS, for your support on Powerloop, but also on the next generation of V2X, so vehicle to grid, vehicle to home, a really important use case we haven't really lent into of how valuable it is just to be able to put energy into your home so you stop consuming energy. You choose when you use that stored energy. A vehicle to building. So I think the government is doing a good job, and we have to continue as we are. And ISO 15118 is published, it's there, it's here, and the OEMs are leaning into it. The vehicle manufacturers are leaning into it. The charge point operators are leaning into it. Service providers are building on top of it. So I think it's a case of it's going in the right direction. We mustn't stifle it. Yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? There's one up there. Have we got anyone else? Yep. There.
I don't know if you touched on it, Claire, but you mentioned about the battery life taking years for it to die out, so to say. So is there no concern, obviously the main focus is in the environment, is there no concern over the rate of electric vehicles being produced and the rate of waste management companies being able to recycle these batteries?
So it's a good question. I think that if you look at all the innovation that we need on this transition, all the different parts of it, it's super exciting, but it's a bit mind-blowing. So when we think about recycling, there's some really great work now going on in Warwick Manufacturing Group are looking at it. There are other groups that are looking at projects around recycling. But we don't have to couple that to what's going on right now around battery life and battery technology. So it's happening. We don't have to couple those two things together. And then in terms of battery technology, I think that's something we haven't touched on, and we could be here all day. So I won't go too far into it, but I think it's really exciting looking at the way that battery management systems are evolving to cope with different types of charging, which they haven't in the past. Okay, so by different types, I mean different speeds of charging. Charging at home, on a driveway, or on the street is a really nice life for a battery. And actually, people ask me about V2G, does it not kill the battery because you're using it all up? No, the battery loves it. It's a really nice place for the battery to be, charging and discharging gently. But battery management systems are improving so that rapid charging is not having such an impact. It does have an impact on the battery, we can't deny that, but not so much. And then other technologies altogether. So we haven't touched on, the lithium technologies that are prevalent today, and actually the sodium-ion batteries that are coming and becoming.
So as well, if I may ask, what about the glass battery? Does that help the hydrogen kind of methodology, or does it go against it? I don't know too much about it. I was kind of curious.
I think that's probably a tiny bit too detailed for this panel, so I will stop there, but I'm happy to chat afterwards. I think
can I add one interesting thing? So I was chatting to the guys from British Volt this week, and they were actually saying they're interested to see that because of the certificates of origin, how much has to come from known sources. Yeah. They think there's going to be a huge asset in batteries to be feedstock for new batteries, which is why publicly you've seen Glencore do a deal with the land immediately next door to the British Volt factory. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So one of the interesting things from my perspective is, and again, this is just as someone who's interested in this space, right, is will the value be in an avoided cost of the waste of a battery for a car manufacturer? Will it be valued by the value somebody puts on home storage and the flexibility, or will the value be set of the battery because of its feedstock for new batteries?
I agree.
I mean, the nice thing is, that's 3 options for batteries to set the price of a used battery. So for me, it'd be really interesting to see how those things, those competitive tensions, could put a future value on a battery.
Yeah, and something else you mentioned there is about, companies started to co-locate and clusters. And I think something that, Fiona, you mentioned was about bringing that together in terms of integration. And something I'm really excited about is how vertically integrated can we get when it comes to things like battery technologies, hydrogen technologies, and actually, everything from those raw materials all the way through. And I think that if we're going to, have security of supply of energy and security of supply of vehicles, we need to focus on that vertical integration. But I don't know how that works in hydrogen.
Yeah, it's exactly that. Yeah, we do need that level of integration, and also, the role of the different technologies. It's going to take a whole raft of different technologies to make that decarbonisation actually come to fruition. Mm-hmm. So it's not either battery electric or fuel cell electric. Absolutely. It's the whole system.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Thank you. Great question.
Courses,
any more questions?
So apologies if it's cheating a bit to kind of ask the facilitator a question, but I think, we've heard from Graeme and we've heard from Claire about kind of V2G and V2X from kind of an energy system and from a consumer perspective. I guess I'm also interested from kind of an auto manufacturer angle. So I think, when I started kind of working on bidirectional charging, even last year, there was kind of a key barrier was, not many kind of vehicle manufacturers are potentially interested. There's not many cars available. Over kind of the last year, we've definitely seen a huge kind of level of increase in the interest from EV manufacturers. Lots of kind of enabling stuff going on, like the everybody's lucky number, the ISO 15118 standard that Claire talked about. And I guess from kind of Peter's perspective, I guess I'm interested in, do you think, vehicle to grid, but also I guess kind of similar innovations? Do you think it's a matter of, some EV manufacturers will lead and then all will follow? Or do you think there'll kind of be points of differentiation between kind of different manufacturers and some will kind of go really kind of far into particular technologies, and some will kind of be more kind of resistant or go into other ones, or do you think they'll all kind of align at some point in the future?
I think we're still, and I'm going to put aside the obvious rule that you're not allowed to ask me questions, but I think we're still at the early stage, right, at the moment in this entire transition. As much as we talk about the tipping point, as much as we see EV sales, we are at very, 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 very early stages of the game, and people do not know which technologies play out, which ways of refueling those technologies play out. Renault has looked at battery swapping and looked at wireless charging and even on-the-move wireless charging, and people are thinking about bidirectional charging and other stuff. Nissan obviously led in it with the Leaf because they had the CHAdeMO system that lent itself to two-way charging. And even when they first talked about vehicle-to-grid, which I think must have been like 5 years ago, they said even then the number of Nissan Leafs in the UK, between them had enough energy equivalent of a small power station. So I think it's, and they were talking about the way you try and get consumers to go for this was to pay them a bit of money from grid if they put their energy back in and things. The problem that the manufacturers have, I think, at the moment is that there are so many potential solutions out there. Some of them might be sort of conceptually interesting and, all right, well, if that helps balance the grid, fine, but that's not my primary concern. My primary concern is to sell my cars and hit my CO2 targets. The problem I think that you have is that how many manufacturers are seriously going to go, yes, let us build two-way charging into our system as a way of potentially getting consumers to buy cars, because we don't know if people want that when they buy an electric car versus if they don't want that, is that a competitive advantage? Is it not? I think the problem is there's just so many options they could go for. Do you go for battery swapping, right? And the problem with that is that you need to make batteries that you can swap with other vehicles as well, and it doesn't just work if it's one brand to take off in a big way. There's so many unknowns in this, and we're not going to know for years which of them are going to take off. It could be that vehicle-to-grid becomes a very major thing. It could often be, and you'll know this very well, sitting the side of the fence that you do, that actually regulation pushes this, right? So it's no accident that we have lots of electric cars on sale in exactly the year that the very tough European CO2 targets came into force. And it's no accident everyone is going for electric cars because they've got the end date inside in 2030, 2035, whenever it turns out to be. It's possible that from a regulation side, you say all new electric vehicles have to be able to plug that into the grid and recharge into the grid because that will help us balance the system. And then, you know what? I think the manufacturers will find a way to do it if they're told to. So that's very much a non-answer, but feeds in all the different ways that I'd think about what I'd put into that equation. But the honest answer is we're so early, we've no idea what the answers are. Car makers don't have the answers. They don't know. They're all seeing the same things we're seeing, and they're all coming up with different potential solutions. Fundamentally, the way you think about the kind of landscape at the moment is you've got a big board, and the car makers have a certain number of chips. And can they put chips on these bits? Can they cover everything and still be certain to win in the one that takes off as the final solution? And we just don't know at the moment. And it's what's causing the strategy guys at the car makers lots of headaches at the moment. But thank you, that's a good question. So, anyone else? There was one other hand, I think, that went up.
Whilst you're looking for the hand,
Go on.
bearing in mind I don't make energy and I don't make cars,
Yes.
I think I've got an interesting view on this.
Go on.
I think for energy businesses are likely to pivot a bit because the car is the gateway to the energy transaction. So you could find power companies buying car companies or designing their own cars. Mm-hmm. I think car companies, instead of delivering a product, will want to deliver a solution. So could you see a car company buy an energy company? So I think for me, it could actually be more about business model innovation rather than actually mandating a particular
That's a really
standard.
good point. And what Tesla has shown, Tesla's showed us many things. One of the things Tesla's shown us even now is that actually owning a charging infrastructure, if it works, is actually a competitive advantage right now. Because right now, I get a lot of people asking me if they should buy an electric car, right? Or if they should get a Tesla, or if they should get something else. And my answer is always, you know, the risk you take buying a Tesla is the build quality, the after sales, all of those experiences. But the plus side is you have an absolutely outstanding infrastructure system that you know works and is basically everywhere. If you buy something else, it will probably be a better vehicle. It will probably be better in 5 years' time. And you have an established network to go with it, but you're then reliant on public infrastructure, which we all know is an issue that needs a little bit of work. So that's the challenge at the moment. But owning an energy system, when they put it in, people thought they were mad, and it turns out actually it's a phenomenal help to them at the moment in terms of selling cars. Whether that equalises as we get into a more mature market, I don't know. But at the moment, that element of business model innovation has really served them well. Chap there had a question.
Yes, I had sort of two questions. I think first one is for Claire. I mean, what's Octopus's experience of consumer, have you had consumers saying, look, I can't deal with electric cars, or it doesn't get the range, I don't get what I want from it, I'm going back, I'm giving my subscription, going back to an ICE car. Have you seen do you have sort of any stats on that, or that'd be interesting. And I suppose my other question is for Fiona, I suspect, given that the Scottish government is quite a big buyer of all this transportation infrastructure, why aren't they able to scale it up? I mean, I imagine the private sector is not very big in buses or trucks, but why doesn't the NHS in Scotland says, well, we will buy 10,000 vans or whatever it is they need to buy? Presumably that's the main problem, isn't it? There's not enough scale because I've seen news of somebody buying 5 hydrogen buses. That doesn't really create any supply chains. Nobody's going to build any supply chains to service 5 hydrogen buses. So clearly the only way you can do it is if you said, like they do it in China, where they say, well, we'll buy 10,000 hydrogen buses or whatever it is they want to do. Why is that not possible, or what's the kind of
no,
issue?
it is possible, but obviously you've got to have the hydrogen production to match the offtake, and it's just how we start to scale up the production and the offtake in terms of the vehicles is a challenge, but it's all doable.
The hydrogen production is already there. At the moment you probably will be using grey hydrogen, and at some stage you can replace it with blue and then green hydrogen.
So for vehicles, we would look at green hydrogen, probably blue or grey, more to look at the gas grid, because of the purity of the green hydrogen. But it's just getting those economies to actually scale up and work. It's what is that point where you actually can make it affordable to really, for the NHS, for instance, to actually say, yeah, we can take so many vehicles. They've got to trial first. It's got to have a deployment put in place. It takes time. It's doable, but it's going to need a lot of collaboration of organisations coming together to actually make it happen. But you can do it, but it'll be a challenge.
Right.
But we're starting to scale up. We've gone from novel, and now we're scaling up. But it's going to take time.
And Claire.
Sorry, Claire.
No, please, no. Hydrogen is something I know very little about, so I'm really excited. I'm learning as well as we go. So I think the question was, do we see people being disappointed with an EV and going back? No. We don't.
Good.
The long answer is no, because it is such a transformative experience to have an EV, as I say, even for a couple of days, a weekend, and as you start to live with it, because they're more fun to drive, because there is this instant, power delivery. There's no lag. You're not waiting for the fuel to be burnt and the piston to move and the compression to. So they're much more fun to drive. They're easier to drive. They're very pleasing to drive because there's a satisfying feeling to knowing that you're not pumping anything out and you're not impacting air quality. And the more you live with it, the more, as we said before, you learn that, how do I use my energy? I have an option here. It starts to open up all sorts of other avenues. So we just don't see people going back. And I think there are statistics now. I can't quote any today, but I have read a variety of things recently about the number of people who do go back. Obviously, there will be a few people who go back and poo-poo it, but the vast majority don't go back.
I'm very aware that the plural of anecdote isn't data, right? But I talk to a lot of EV drivers. My job, I must have talked to more than 100 easily. And the number of people I know who have had an EV, and all right, every EV owner currently at the moment has a horror story about breaking down and all this stuff, and everyone knows this, right? But the number of people who've gone back out of those 100 and whatever I've talked to is one, right? Who's gone back to a nice car. And that was a particular circumstance where he basically fell out with the electric car company because he rapid charged the battery 5 times a day and destroyed it, and then fell and went back for another option. But everybody else has stayed with that and will not go back. It's a one-way street. So, which is, I imagine, what your data shows. Yeah, exactly, as well. Unless there are any final questions, I am conscious we are out of time. But that is the end of it at the moment from here, from the stage, from this fantastic and historic room, I would say, which has been an absolute pleasure to be in and to be speaking in. But thank you very much to our speakers. Thank you to Rachel, John, Harsh, Graeme, Claire and Fiona. Thank you to you for coming. And please do join us outside afterwards for a drink. Thank you.